So thank you for joining us. Today I'm excited to talk about T-Bone Burnett, A Life in a Pursuit with author Lloyd Sachs. For those of us who are joining us on Zoom, post your questions in the chat. And for those of you in the room, please be thinking about what you'd like to ask. We'll get to audience questions at the end, and I'll either read them out from Zoom or repeat any in-person questions for Lloyd to answer. So let me start by introducing him. Lloyd Sachs is the author and audible narrator of the critical biography T-Bone Burnett, A Life in Pursuit, as well as the author of American Country, Bluegrass, Honky Tonk, and Crossover Sounds. As the former pop culture journalist, columnist, and jazz critic for the Chicago Sun-Times, he wrote about music for many publications, including Rolling Stone, Downbeat, Playboy, The Washington Post, and No Depression, where he was a senior editor. He reviews fiction for Kirkus Reviews and was a crime fiction columnist for the Chicago Tribune. So we are so happy to have you here. Why don't you start with talking a little bit about the book, and if you'd like to read a passage, that's great. And then we'll just have a conversation.
Oh, wow. Well, that's pretty wide open. This is a book that I really actually hadn't expected to write, because when I was first talking with the people at the University of Texas Press, I had been pitching a book about Rosanne Cash and Rodney Crowell, who were the king and queen of the new Nashville back in the 80s. And I was basically told it was a slam dunk that book was going to get approved. But it wasn't approved by the board or whoever at UT, partly because Rodney and Rosanne actually both had books of their own out, memoirs, but books in which they really didn't touch on music all that much. They were more personal, their personal stories. Rodney's growing up in a difficult household. Rosanne, of course, growing up as of Johnny Cash. But after I was told that, one of the editors there said that they heard there was a rumor they wanted to write a book about T-Bone Burnett. And I was surprised to hear that, since I hadn't said anything. But I had written a long cover piece about T-Bone in No Depression magazine. If those of you don't know, I mean, it was the ranking alt country or whatever that is magazine for a number of years. A lot of great writing by a lot of great writers across the country. And it still exists in a online form. I don't think they're printing it again. But anyway, I said, yeah, well, I can write a book about T-Bone. And one reason that I really was drawn to that project, in addition to being very fond of T-Bone, who I'd talked to over the years several times for the Chicago Sun-Times, and had hung out with them a couple times in informal settings. But I think I write in the book, my mission was to make T-Bone's great contribution as a singer and songwriter in his own right, to make people aware of that. I don't know who's out there in the audience now, but I'd be really curious to know, A, what brought you to this chat, and B, how you identify T-Bone. What do you know him from? Is it as a music producer for the Coen brothers, for films like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is it from his production work for other artists, which is a long list of artists, ranging from Los Lobos and Elvis Costello to just countless albums. And so that became my main pursuit in writing A Life in Pursuit. I wanted to expose and to celebrate T-Bone's great music career, as well as his career as really one of the great producers in all of music.
So, as you kind of mentioned, kind of depends on where you know him from, right? Because he's had this kind of varied and different career, and he's touched so many different things. And so you've kind of talked about that. Was there something specifically beyond trying to figure out kind of the different aspects of his life that really, pulled you in and thought, "Ooh, this is the part I really need to write more about, or I need to research more about to kind of flesh out what you were thinking about him."
Yeah. Well, another aspect of this is people generally, maybe people are a little more hip about this now, but people generally don't know what a producer does. Oh, well, he produced that album. What does that mean? Was he behind the soundboard twisting dials and getting, well, that could be part of his job, but that's actually the job of the engineer. Some producers are involved in engineering, but other producers are not. So, what is it that makes this producer able to basically take an artist or a group, uh, go into the studio with them and produce what will stand in, I would say, 80% of the cases as the best thing they will ever do. A lot of, and most of the artists have gone on to work with other producers, but at least in my opinion, uh, those efforts, as good as they are, don't measure up to what they were able to achieve with T-Bone Burnett. And as a producer, he's very he puts a real emphasis on kind of warming the studio experience, rather than having people isolated in booths and not even communicating with each other. He brings in lamps, warm lamps into the room. I think he uses this um, what is that you light? The incense. He had a particular kind of incense from South America that had these great spiritual properties. But as Joe Henry said, Joe Henry being a singer and songwriter and producer who's a protege of T-Bone's, that T-Bone uh, doesn't just hire people because of their skills. He also hires people for who they are as individuals, what kind of character they have, and all of that stuff kind of impacts the final result, because he has very good relationships with most of the people he's worked with. There've been a couple, where he didn't get along with somebody, but if you talk to the people he's produced, as I have, everybody has just great things to say about him as a person as well as a producer. Um, he's the kind of producer who sometimes will just not even come into the studio because he thinks that that's not always necessary, that a band may be able to find itself and find their voice a little bit better on a project if he's not standing there telling them what to do or help or trying to guide them. So between his songwriting and his own records and his producing and his film work, which has been exemplary. He also did the music for the HBO series. I guess I can't call it HBO anymore. Now it's Max. But he did the music for True Detective. using very kind of experimental sounds. If you go back and look at that show again, pay attention to the music. So all of that, I mean, that's a bushel full of stuff to write about.
Well,
Can't
and
believe I said bushel full, living here in Chicago and not having seen a bushel, but go ahead.
I did find like his producing style to be really interesting as you talked about it through the book. Like you said, sometimes he doesn't show up. Sometimes he's like, just sit in the room and play and see what happens. And then other times he's like, yeah, I'm going to bring in different people than who are actually in your band, and they're going to play the stuff for the recording. And then, you guys just play it live. Right. So it's this very interesting sort of mix of, you never really know what you're going to get with him, I think, maybe.
Well, but one example of how you absolutely do know what you're going to get. He is rare among producers. He uses musicians that he first started working with 40 years ago. He maintains connections with these great musicians and really has gathered together, a core ensemble of people who play with him. And that just adds a lot because they know each other. They know, how to approach certain challenges. And it's just amazing to me that, a horn player from Oklahoma, who we first started playing with when he was producing uh, albums in his own studio as a teenager, that this guy could still be on an album that he's making for somebody.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating kind of how he's maintained those relationships, and some of those relationships are from people right here in this area in Fort Worth, right? Because he born here, kind of
Right.
raised here. We were talking before that we started that the book starts with the opening of the Caravan of Dreams, and with Ornette Coleman, and kind of just all of that integral kind of Fort Worth music history that he's also very much a part of, which a lot of people may not really know about him, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. He, as a young guy, he just absorbed all of these regional sounds when it comes to blues and Tex-Mex and country, hardcore country. Um, And when he was still a teenager, he used to duck out at night and go hear these great blues musicians in different clubs, and it's just it kind of became part of his DNA that this is who he was as a musician, and but he also, what separated him, we have to go back, and I'm sure this will go way, way, way back too much for some of the people here, but uh, following the Beatles invasion back in the early 60s, uh, some musicians some veteran musicians didn't want to have much to do with this new pop revolution, and T-Bone he was totally into it and started writing songs with the Beatles influence and started performing them with his close mates. And so he's carried that forth as well. The whole sense of what makes good songwriting, what makes a good melody. And as a producer, I should point out, he, in lieu, I'm not, in memory of Tina Turner, one of the most influential nights he ever had was seeing Ike and Tina Turner at the what ballroom? Somebody can shout that out. Where the sound was so particular to his ears that he tried to duplicate that sound for many years and really modeled his own production, evolved over the years, but it's still there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that he, as a teenager, he had his own studio. He was doing his own things, and then he's had so many kind of interesting relationships with where he might not be a household name, right? But like he's played with Bob Dylan. He's been part of that, the big, the big review and all of those things with him, and so many other artists. And do you think that he has influenced them or they have influenced his style in some ways?
Interesting question. It would be really interesting to hear from Dylan that T-Bone influenced him. I'm not sure Dylan is influenced by anybody from his roots sources. Um, I I would, well, T-Bone certainly has influenced other producers in the kind of sound that he gets. He has a very, and he's kind of evolved, but his trademark sound has a very warm bottom, and there's a very fullness of sound, but yet it gives musicians room to move within that soundscape. And well, Joe Henry, who I mentioned before, who's produced some of the greatest artists of our day, from Alan Toussaint to Solomon Burke to Mary Gauthier to Joan Baez. Um, he was strongly influenced by T-Bone's sound, and there have been other producers as well. And but on the other hand, there are people who find it too what's the word, that they don't like it. It's too controlling, or but most of the artists who've worked for him are really glad that they have.
No, I
Yeah.
mean, I love that he's, that there's this part of he is kind of directing and maybe getting things out of people that they didn't expect they were gonna do, or that he was gonna be able to get for them. But at the same time, he's also building those relationships, and then he maintains them. So you've talked to some about kind of his sound and what he's known for. And there was quite a bit of discussion in the book kind of about just how he kind of approaches being in the studio. Can you kind of talk about, besides just kind of setting the mood sort of things, but how he kind of directs how the studio stuff is working?
Yeah. Well, he's one of those producers who basically, each project is different, and each project requires kind of different things from him and his core musicians. He, if there was a documentary made about T-Bone and the making of which album was it? I think I should probably look that up. But it was it was a documentary that basically gave you a sense of the responsibilities that all of the musicians took upon themselves in terms of certain technical aspects of the project, even going down to making the wiring was correct. But he has musicians that, among them the really unbelievable drummer Jay Belrose, who creates like his own instant weather on the drums. Just the different textures he gets and the different sounds and drums he gets. It's just a really remarkable player. And just the fact he's there to begin with will tell you, give you a clue as to what T-Bone is looking for on a particular project. Um, but he's very easygoing in the studio. He's not one to basically tell musicians what to do. which a lot of producers do. Can you give me more of this, me more of that? T-Bone is more of just the musicians he has. If he didn't trust them, they wouldn't be in the room. I mean, he's, so he will throw out an occasional suggestion about where a song might go. In the case of Raising Sands, the really great album he produced for Rob Plant and Alison Krauss, there was one example I mentioned in the book where originally he was gonna, it was just assumed that he was gonna sing this one song, this blues kind of influence thing. And T-Bone decided he would like to have Alison Krauss sing it and see what kind of special things he could get out of her, because this was not her usual neighborhood of stuff, of styles. And if you listen to the album, it's just it was just great. I mean, and a lot of those choices are just sometimes improvised, sometimes it's nothing is taken for granted when they're in the studio about how things are going to go.
He also has a whole thing about like the tracking, right? Where a lot of times when they record in the studio, right? Like they record one part first and then they come back and they record the next part on it. But he doesn't do that, right? He kind of records everybody all at the same time, right? Is that kind of how I understood that, which is very different from how stuff is done usually?
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions, but he believes in what they used to call live in the studio recordings, where people aren't separated behind panels of glass or whatever, panels of vinyl, where people are able to relate to each other, where they're able to look in each other's eyes and create a more natural kind of sound. Um, and it's something that some producers can do well and others can't. But the very notion of, see, with who was it with I think it was with Los Lobos. um there's certain producers and people in music who believe that the best way to capture a hot band live is to put them in the studio and try to reproduce the rawness and the angularity and the mistakes that a band plays live at, and I emphasize the word raw. But T-Bone recognized from early going that studio recordings and live recordings are different animals altogether. They require different rules, and being in the studio has its own kind of methods in order to capture that artist in the best way possible. And that's always been T-Bone's primary goal, is to capture that artist in the best possible way, to show off his strengths, or to show off their strengths.
So kind of with that, he's been an advocate of, as how we get our music has changed, whether it's CDs, streaming. And he's really been an advocate for sound quality and artist integrity too. Can you kind of talk about his activism in these spaces and kind of how that also informs
Oh
how he
boy.
does his job?
Well, sure. T-Bone, his heroes were the producers from the 50s who worked with analog sound. And he on any number of occasions has vented about how terrible MP3s are and how terrible digital sound is, for that matter. And when you're winning Grammy awards as he did for racing, and you're kind of going after the system for their refusal to try to improve the sound of recordings, then not everybody's good buddies with T-Bone. And he has, who knows? He's been working on alternative methods of recording for years now. I don't know if anybody remembers, but he once put out an album, a very good album with John Cougar Mellencamp, or I guess it's just John Mellencamp now, that used DVR sound technology. The sound is noticeably better than the sound on CDs, as all gamers might know. And so they put out that album in both versions, in the CD version and in the DVR version. And that was basically Elvis Costello was supposed to come out with an album in that format as well, but that never happened, and it just kind of faded out. Now maybe he couldn't get the money to keep moving forward on that project, but more recently, just even last year, he introduced yet another new technology. He and Bob Dylan re-recorded "Blowing in the Wind" using this new technology, which was proclaimed a whole new medium, that if you go online, you'll see a photo of the aluminum platter they were holding up that this was recorded on. They call them ionic originals. And the promise was that Dylan, they were going to end up, doing a whole album of in this particular technology, and that you have to understand T-Bone, and if T-Bone is watching, I mean this only in the best way. He's got a lot of P.T. Barnum in him. Um, I think he would love to have these. Would love to have the sound revolution he's been talking about for years, but some of his plans have proven not too practical, or maybe unrealistic, or whatever. But the proof is in the pudding, I guess. Yes, but is a stickler for sound, and he's worked hard on devising, not only devising what some people might call his trademark sound, but he's also moved beyond. You listen to um, the sequel to Raising Sand that he produced with Robert Plant and Alison Krauss, and it came out a couple of years ago. Um, Another really, really good album, but it's different. It has a whole different quality to it. It has more of a kind of lightness and flow from one song to another than Raising Sand, where each song in itself was a production, and the songs kind of that they all boasted this kind of interesting production is what really linked them together. With the newer album, there's more a sense of continuity, of being the album is of a piece, maybe more than the other one. So he's at it. And I should also point out, he's put out a couple of albums after a long, long time away from recording. He put out a couple of albums of electronic music, where he basically speaks over the music, which features again Jay Bellerose on drums, and Keefa Siansha, who's been his go-to guy on keyboards and various forms of production. Uh, and I have no idea how many people have heard those albums. I know they're on Spotify. Which you might say, well, if he hates threes and he hates all that. So why is he on Spotify? These T-Bone is a man of many contradictions, and that's okay with me.
Well, and I think at one point in the book, you kind of talk about it. First, it was kind of like, no, don't have your music out on streaming because the sound is terrible. But then, I mean, nowadays, if your music isn't streaming, for the most part, no one's hearing it, right? Because unless you're a vinyl person, right?
Well,
There's not a lot of other ways to get your music these days.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. He was advising young musicians to not stream your music, and there was definite pushback by any number of artists saying, "What are you, nuts? How get our music out there?" And vinyl has made a comeback. I kind of sometimes skeptical about, even when I'm shown numbers of sales because I still think it's a kind of boutique medium where people are spending more money than they should on albums that they may not have the equipment at home to bring out the full measure of. You can spend $25 on a vinyl album, but if you're going to play it on your old system, it's not going to be worth the money. I am not speaking here as an expert. And just, if you feel like writing me letters, that's fine. But this just from what my own responses.
I have lots of friends who are very into vinyl right now, and I personally am like, man, that's just like more stuff I gotta buy, right? So I kind of get the are you gonna do it? Aren't gonna do it? So you've talked about this Raising Sand CD because I mentioned that I've been listening to it for like the last couple of days. I did check it out from the library. So are there some other either actual albums of his or other ones that he's worked on that you think are must listen tos?
You were frozen there for a second. Now you're back.
Okay.
Were you just dodging my question about whether the Fort Worth Library charges fines for late?
I did not hear that question, but the question is no, we do not. We are fine free.
Good for you. It's that way in Chicago as well.
So my question was, because it sounds like we were both asking each other questions at the same time, was obviously I had said I have been listening to this for the last couple of days. Are there other albums that either he's produced or that is actually him that you think are in the must listen for him?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I in the book, in the back of the book, I provide a brief kind of listing of albums. My favorites range from of things he's produced. The Los Lobos album is still one of my favorites. I actually did two of them. And the more recently, here's another example for me anyway. He produced an album by Rhiannon Giddens in a very different mode than what she has since spent most of her time in, which is a kind of roots music, banjo oriented, Native American, black oriented music, black roots music. But she does a kind of a variety of songs on there, and I just think it's a wonderful album. Also the album by Dylan's son, Jacob Dylan. What was that band? The
Wallflowers.
The Wallflowers. That album that first album by the Wallflowers, as far as I'm concerned, the first, I guess what you would call side, or the first 4 or 5 songs are basic perfection. They're just really, really great, and it's just a wonderful production job in terms of who he involved in playing on that album. Um, what had happened was that Jacob basically hadn't gotten along with the previous person who he was working with on records, and Bob thought that might be a good idea for T-Bone to supervise him, and T-Bone just really, it was an inspired piece of work. I'm sure I'm leaving and Sam Phillips, T-Bone produced a number of albums by his now ex-wife Sam Phillips that are just really beautiful exercises in pop music. Just terrific songwriting on her part, terrific productions on on his part. Among his own albums, Truth Decay has some of the greatest songs on there, and it's very much a kind of Buddy Holly in some ways influenced rock album. And then he went on to do this pure country album um, that some people say is their favorite, has River of Love on it, and it's just a beautiful album of hymnal type ballads, and um, that's a great album. But I basically most of his albums, I find there's something, if they're not 100% great, that there's certainly standout tracks on there that you keep coming back to again and again. Trying to think of who else. A lot of people also, Elvis, one of Elvis Costello's best albums was produced by T-Bone in Los Angeles, largely, called King of America. Um, so there you go. You can just keep going, it's
Some
a lot of great
great things
stuff.
to
And
check
it's
out and
just,
listen to.
I'm just sorry that he, and who knows why. I mean, early in his career, T-Bone definitely wanted to become a star along the lines of a Jackson Browne or a Warren Zevon. And when it didn't happen, I think he became very discouraged. It's one of the reasons he was so long out of the studio and not recording his own stuff. I mean, we're talking, there have been gaps of 10, 12 years. And I'm just sorry that, I'm glad he's been doing these electronic things, which I like. But I would just like to see him make at least one more T-Bone Burnett album. Maybe that'll happen.
We can all hope, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't talked about music producing much. We've had a little mention of it with Oh Brother and True Detective, but I really think the story kind of behind the Oh Brother CD and all of that is really fascinating. So can you kind of talk about his kind of starting with music, producing for movies, and then kind of how he chose and assembled the songs for that particular album?
Uh-oh. It's been a while since I read this book. But generally, T-Bone, he approached, and it's in the book, he actually approached Joel Cohen because he was a fan of some of their movies, and they got into a discussion, and I think it was just a matter of the Coens asking whether he would want to do the songs for Oh Brother. And T-Bone always has, stacks of possible songs that to choose from for an album. I mean, Raising Sand, they must have had 200 songs that they could have chosen from. And none of those, trying to think if any of their songs are originals. They're mostly covers of a lot of American classics, roots classics. In this case, what made this project so different was, um, most with most movies, the music comes after the scenes are shot. In this case, he was asked to write or to put together the whole score before any of the scenes had been shot. And so what the Coens ended up doing was basically listening to what he had, and in some ways devising scenes that would go along with it. Again, it's been a while since I read that book or that stuff, but I'm pretty sure that that's what happened. And the artists that he chose for it, were the familiar, like Alison Krauss, Gillian Welch, whose album, her album that he produced is another example of one I don't think she surpassed. Um, but and I should throw in, Gillian Welch and David Rawlings. But it was a pretty eclectic soundtrack. And it just gave a wide range of musicians in country and roots, and people who hadn't been heard in years, um, gave them an opportunity. Let me just quickly jog my memory here. This is what happens when you put on a few years, as you I mean, the most heartwarming story to come out of that. One second. Was the basic, resurrection of Ralph Stanley. Ralph Stanley, who we all know as, one of the greatest pure country singers ever. And as I write in the book, to never hear Stanley's version of "Oh Death is Not to Live," and that was one of the real linchpins of the movie. But Dan Tominski, Alison Krauss, Gillian Welch, the Fairfield Four. But Ralph Stanley was able to buy a house for himself, for his mother. I think it was for himself. He was able to buy a house based on his earnings from Oh Brother, and he also was able to make some records in the wake of Oh Brother that maybe he wouldn't have gotten to make if not. But that was just an amazing success story, because who would have thought that this basic album of mountain music would strike such a chord in people, not just in country, not just country fans, but people all over. It was a huge seller, and it it inspired. I mean, it really made possible the careers of any number of artists and bands following. Suddenly find buzz because of that album, and it was a remarkable kind of cultural moment in America.
I mean, yeah, it's so, I think that even we're still talking about it today, right? That was more than a decade ago. It's still, right, something that we're still talking about today. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to actually talk about you. So talk about your actual writing process and kind of how you take your research and then how you turn that into kind of words on the page.
Wow. Well, I am definitely, I'm not a fast writer. I'll tell you that right away. Um, my method with the T-Bone book was basically to gather as much information from as many sources as I could. As you know, T-Bone didn't want to talk to me for the book, even though he talked to me numerous times for newspaper interviews or for that magazine piece. Um, he just, I don't know. I still don't know exactly why, but the idea of his life story being told, I think, spooked him a little bit in terms of the mortality question. Um, but in the end, he ended up helping me get photographs for the book, and he allowed me to talk to all of these artists that he was close to, which he didn't have to do either. But everyone would call him and say, "Is it okay if I talk to Sachs?" And he said, "Oh yeah, he's a good person." So when I heard that, I go, "Well, that's good." But I would just, obviously with going online, there was a lot I could find in uh, libraries and college libraries and their databases. And I did a bunch of personal interviews to gather more stuff. I mean, I flew out to Los Angeles and spent a long lunch with Sam Phillips in Hollywood. Um, and I'm forever grateful to her for really her generosity with that. Um, but once I've got all of the material that I need, I start thinking of how I want to organize the book. And my initial my initial thought was T-Bone had a book out called the True False Identity. And my idea was to call the book The True False Identity, or something along those lines, in which I would break each chapter, where I would devote each chapter to a different aspect of his identity as a producer. And actually, that's what I ended up doing mostly. Um, and I'll tell you the story of how I got the title, because they got back to me and said, "Oh, we're afraid that that title might be a little too confusing with the double negative or whatever." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I went to bed and I woke up around 3 in the morning and I just said, "Oh, maybe this will work." And I wrote it down. And, as is the case with most things you think of at 3 in the morning, it never pans out. But this one, when I said, I thought we might call it T-Bone Burnett in Pursuit, A Life in Pursuit. And there was a momentary silence. And my editor said, "Wait, I think that let me run that by let me run that by them." I said, "Okay." Then they got back to me and said, "Yeah, they love that title." Uh, so which told me that I should probably start forcing myself to wake up at 3 in the morning to come up with some ideas for articles or whatever. But for me, it's kind of painstaking because I'm a slow writer, and I'm kind of anal when it comes to I mean, some people can just write loosely and write out the whole thing and then go back and edit it and make it better. I mean, I'm just more like, although that's what I had to end up doing. Um, so it takes me a while, but in the case of this project, um, there was so much great music that I was listening to that it kind of gave me a boost that I might not have had otherwise. And where I was just discovering a few things as I was listening that I hadn't heard before. Um, and what happens in the process is you send your manuscript in, and then they have somebody
Revisions.
somebody who's going to who's going to copy edit it, who as far as I know may have been in, you know, I don't know, South America for all I know. And he got back to me with stuff, and then I had another X amount of time to write the final version. And so that's what happened. Um, but the people at UT were pretty good when it came to that.
Well, I will say that we love the music series books from UNT. We I have pulled many of those to do authors visits with, because music is really important to us as a library. We do a lot of musical programming, and so and they have such great, really great written and fascinating stories about you know, so many great artists. So is there anything else about the book we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
Well, like I said, I'll have to read it again. No, it's uh there are I just find, you know, like I said, the T-Bone is just a guy of contradictions, and there's like a little P.T. Barnum in him, and so sometimes he says stuff. He uses a lot of superlatives to describe. So, like, you know, talk about Cassandra Wilson being, I don't know, the Ella Fitzgerald of her day or something, just fantastic, because he produced an album by Cassandra Wilson, who is probably the greatest living jazz singer. But some people will disagree because she has her style is not what you would call a swinging style. It's different. It's more like a Miles Davis kind of almost modal type of just floating over. Anyway, um, and I would, you know, I would go back and say, wait a minute, Sandra Wilson doesn't have anything to do with Ella Fitzgerald. If you were to compare her, you might want to compare her with Sarah Vaughan, maybe, uh, and Betty Carter. So sometimes got the feeling that it was just, and there were other cases where, you know, you have to be on guard uh, to double check stuff that is said and promised. Um, and in fact, I did talk to his longtime engineer about why there were no more of those albums with the DVR sound, like the John Mellencamp. And he said basically, well, that they thought that they had made their point and that the industry would pick up on that or something along those lines. And I just, something wasn't right there. So, but that's the way it goes. But there was one of the entertaining aspects of the book is there was this some kind of website I found in which they had a transcript of the conversations that he was having with people writing to him following this music tech conference. He was on the plane heading home, and he was answering these letters while he was on the plane, and just this long thing where he's basically, you know, some of these people were haranguing him and giving him a hard time about his, you know, old-fashioned views or whatever. And but he wasn't suffering any fools. But at the same time, he was never insulting, um, or he didn't put down anybody, but it made it clear when someone was saying something dumb that maybe they should reconsider it.
I
But
love that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna turn it over to audience questions. Do we
Okay.
have any questions for anybody in the room? Sure. So one of the questions in the room is they'd like to see a book that you'd write on Roseanne Cash and Rodney Crowell. So
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I was all keyed up to write that book, because really still to this day, when you talk about a lot of the really popular bands in Nashville, what's that band, Little Guitar City or Little, I don't know,
little big town.
Little Big Town, I'm just having fun with that. Um, a lot of those bands were they would not exist if it were not for Rodney Crowell and Roseanne Cash, the recordings in which they started embracing pop and rock music in Nashville, the heart of, mainstream country. And they took a lot of abuse for it. Roseanne Cash took a lot of abuse for it. Her father was Johnny Cash. And so that was a book that I really wanted to write for that particular reason, to just highlight the influence that they had, but it wasn't to be.
Maybe eventually that it'll come back around and maybe they'll come around to it.
Yeah. I haven't seen Roseanne in a while, but I've seen Rodney a couple times in the last several months. He just played a show at the Old Town School of Folk Music that was really, really very good.
I love him. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask one more and then we're going to wrap it up. Are you working on anything new?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask that. I've been juggling a few things, and I'm still not sure where the apple is going to land. Um, but one of them might be a music book. One of them might not be. So, or I might combine them into one music book that's not a music book, or I don't know. Wish me luck, though. It's just I don't know. A lot of people, a lot of people that I would like to write about are no longer with us, and which doesn't mean you can't still write about them, but probably you're not going to get to talk to them for the book. But I guess since I didn't get to talk to T-Bone, I should go ahead with that anyway. But I should mention I have, from my numerous interviews with T-Bone, I had enough comments and quotes from him that really helped a lot. But I don't know. I'll let you know as soon as I know.
All right. Well, we will keep an eye out for it. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you would like to buy a copy of the book, they are available at our local independent bookstore, The Dock. And here is their contact information. We also have copies in the library if you'd like to check one out. And then lastly, we have a couple of great author visits coming up this summer and fall, and we sure hope you join us. Our next one will be with Laura Downey Hill. She's the former mayor of Southlake, and she's going to discuss her book on women and leadership called Walking in My Shoes on August 17th at the Golden Triangle Library. Visit our website, fortworthlibrary.org, for more information. And thank you very much, Lloyd. I had a wonderful conversation, and thanks for spending your time with us this evening.
Thanks. One other thing. If you want to send me the book to sign, I'd be happy to do that. If you want to skip the bookshop and just I can send you a book for whatever the price is. Just contact me via email, which is lloydsachs@gmail.com, and we can work something out. But thanks for being here.
Thank you and have a great evening.